Hey guys, it's Miss Landry here, and we are going to learn all about some approaches to, hang on, there we go, approaches to studying the mind. So this is our second video, and in this case, we're going to really briefly, we're just going to touch on some of them. We will actually be doing a lot more in depth in upcoming units. So let's start with a review. In the last video, we talked about Wilhelm Wundt and his structuralism. So that's where you take apart what you're trying to discover. So he was looking for the pieces that make up emotions. And then we have functionalism, which was William James. He's looking more at how do things function. So looking at the big picture. So that was the last video. Today, what I want you to get out of this video is I want you to understand why psychology and the mind is difficult to study. We'll also look at different approaches to psychology. We will predict the approach based on the method of study. And I also want you to identify the main scientists involved in either developing this approach or are best known for this approach. And then finally, I want you to be able to give examples of strengths and limitations for each type of approach. So let's just jump right in. So the first one I want you to know about is this idea of, I can never quite pronounce it right, it's Gestalt psychology. This was from Germany, and they basically realized that the human mind doesn't see things in little bits. We actually look at things in a big picture. So we have some examples here. There are 6 basic Gestalt ideas. The first one is closure, where where our mind will actually naturally close an open object. So when you're looking at this, your mind is actually still seeing a triangle. We also tend to clump things together based on similarities. Figure ground has to do with what's in the foreground versus what's in the background. So you're either seeing a vase or 2 faces. So it kind of shifts back and forth. Proximity, we tend to group things together based on how close they are to each other. Enclosure, we like to have things that are enclosed. And then finally, continuance. Even though this white line is actually not there, we think we see it, but there actually is not a white line. So that's Gestalt psychology, and I think it's pretty cool. If you click this right here, there is a short video on Gestalt psychology that kind of goes through each of them with some different examples, and these slides will be available for you, so you can certainly do that. So the first one we're going to talk about, that's kind of a real approach. This was in the late 1800s. It's called the psychoanalytic approach. And this was developed by Sigmund Freud. Now, this is what you think of when you think of psychology, right? The person on the couch, and he's looking at what was your relationship with your parents? And, what was your childhood like? So Sigmund Freud believed that the unconscious is what actually drives your behavior. And so I don't know if you've ever heard of the id, the ego, and the superego. He's the one that kind of developed these ideas. And we're going to go into him in a little bit more detail in another unit, so I'm not going to go into too much of it. He did have some cool quotes. This is one of them. Unexpressed emotions will never die. They're buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. So that's his idea of that unconscious kind of driving your behavior. And then I love this one. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So Sigmund Freud actually believed in this theory called penis envy, and that things like cigars were indicative of that penis envy. And so he did have to say at one point, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So we'll talk more about him. The next one I want to talk about is behaviorism. This is one that I actually really like. It's really interesting. It was brought about by a rejection of psychoanalytical behavior. So if you think about the unconscious, it's very hard. You can't observe the unconscious, right? And so some scientists decided that they wanted to make the study of psychology more scientific. And so behaviorism became a movement. John Watson was one of the scientists involved in this, and he did an experiment that is now called Little Albert. It's really not the most ethical experiment in the world, and you'll see why. So here's a picture of a little baby, and he's playing with this white rat. So this is before he conditions him. What he then did in this experiment is every time the baby would see a white rat, they had a metal bar behind his head that they would hit with a hammer and startle him. And eventually, anything that this kid saw, this little baby saw, that was white and fluffy like the rat, would create fear, and he would start crying. It got to the point where even he became afraid of Santa Claus because of the white beard. So that's an example of an experiment. If you want to see what actually happened in the experiment, again, this link right here is to a short video that goes through the experiment if you want to see a little bit more of it. It's really, I don't know what parent gave that little kid to that experiment. Now, in behaviorism, there are two different schools of thought. So picture behaviorism as like the umbrella, and then there's two types of behavioral approaches. The first is called classical conditioning. So this is brought about, Ivan Pavlov was the one who did the most well-known study in this. You've probably heard like Pavlovian response. This is reflex-based. So basically, Pavlov trained animals to have a reflex on it, like something that triggered that reflex that was not related to it. So I'll give you an example. He's most well known for his dog experiments. So he noticed that his dogs, when given food, would salivate, so that they would start drooling. So what he did is he trained the dog that every time he got food, he would ring a bell. And eventually, over time, all he had to do was ring the bell, and the dog would salivate without food being anywhere near him. So he basically conditioned the dog to think food was coming and have the reflex of the saliva to the bell ringing. The other type of behaviorism is called operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner was most closely related to this. This one is behavior-based. So in this one, there's positive and negative responses or consequences, and that will then build your behavior. So an example of an experiment in this, a mouse presses a certain button and food will come out for him. But if he presses the wrong button, either no food comes out or he might get a shock. A lot of parenting is kind of this way, right? Like if you do something wrong, you're going to get grounded. So that's an example of operant conditioning. I'm going to show you two videos now, and I want you to decide what type of conditioning these videos are indicative of. Is it operant condition or classical conditioning? So let's watch the first one.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance.
Okay, here we go.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you. Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate? Okay. I know what you're doing. Really?
Yes, you're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Okay, so that was the first video. So go ahead and pause the video and answer the question, is it operant conditioning or classical conditioning? Pause the video and now come on back. So that was an example of operant conditioning because Sheldon was trying to get Penny to increase her good behavior, what he thought was good behavior, through positive reinforcement. So now let's watch an example of the other type of conditioning.
I have to reboot again.
Sorry for the quality of the video.
Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? Dwight, want an Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. What are you doing? What? I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden. I have to reboot again.
So that was an example of classical conditioning in which Jim was training Dwight to want an Altoid mint at the sound of his computer rebooting. So eventually, over time, even without the mint, he still wanted the mint. So those are some great examples, and hopefully you enjoyed them. Last one we're going to talk about on this video is the humanistic approach. This was brought about as a rejection of behaviorism because they didn't feel that people should be trained into behaviors. It also was a rejection of psychoanalysis. You can't observe the unconscious, and basically, if your unconscious is driving you, you don't really have free will. So the humanistic approach is a very positive approach. Basically, humans have free will. They can decide their behavior. They have an ability to grow. And everybody in this type of therapy is striving for self-actualization. So that's it for this video. Let's just really quickly go back over the learning objectives. So first of all, why is psychology and the mind difficult to study? We'll touch on that again in the next video. What are the different approaches? We went over 4, and we're going to finish it in the next video. Predict the approach based on the method of study. So you saw the 2 behavioral examples with Jim and Dwight and Big Bang Theory. Identify the main scientists. So we've got Pavlov, we've got John Watson, we've got B.F. Skinner, and Sigmund Freud. And then finally be able to give examples of strengths and limitations of each approach. And so we did that by rejecting them through other approaches. That's it for today. Have a great day, guys.